The Supreme Court has just issued a landmark ruling pertaining to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which covers employment discrimination. The ruling basically says, a 6-3 ruling, that employers cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, before I get started, I want to say the first and most important thing, in my opinion. Employers should not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity because, those honestly, for the most part, have nothing to do with whether or not you can do a job. Somebody who's doing a job, if they do it poorly, if they do something that's, unrelated to their personal issues, well, then you fire them. If you just don't like the persons who they're dating, I think that's kind of a silly reason. Now, there are a lot of complicated questions here as it pertains to liberty versus authority, but more importantly, the letter of the law. Conservatives right now are obviously upset about this, but for the most part, the reason they're upset isn't because they don't like certain people of certain orientations or identity. The main argument I'm seeing from conservatives is that this is legislating from the bench, that basically Democrats and the left have been trying for years to create legislation to get it passed. They've been creating legislation, but they want to get it passed that would add orientation and identity to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, to amend it, and they've been unsuccessful in doing so. Now, with this ruling, they've effectively bypassed the legislative process. There's a really, really interesting argument put forth that, in my opinion, the Supreme Court gets right as it pertains to sexual orientation. However, things get murky when you start talking about gender identity because, well, as we've seen from New York's attempts at legislating this, it starts to break down and become confusing because identity is cultural. Look, if you were to talk about what makes someone trans or not, you'd have to really define where that line is. In our law right now, especially with this ruling, there's no requirement that you actually transition or anything like that. People can be trans simply by saying they are, which creates a potential for, I know it's kind of cliche to say, but a slippery slope. I'm not entirely concerned for the right now what that slippery slope would entail, but I do think I can provide examples of where this may go and why this may become an issue, or ultimately why it may cause more changes. Basically, with this ruling from the Supreme Court, I think they've opened the door to a ton of other arguments related to identity, which includes transracialism, which includes transspeciesism, and also otherkin, which would be people who think they're like mythical creatures or something like that. I know some people have already said, Tim's strawmanning, blah, blah, blah. I tweeted about this, asking what the limits are on this protection. And already all these lefties are like yelling. I never said I completely disagreed with the ruling or anything like that. I think there's a question to be had around it. And personally, I think employers should not be able to discriminate on the basis of these characteristics. However, I think a sane, logical person can have a conversation about what this means and where we go from here without trying to make it some tribal nonsense. So please, for the sake of this video, this video should not be taken to be me arguing for or against anything. I want to talk about what this means for our civilization. All right, let's read the story from the Associated Press. Justices rule LGBT people protected from job discrimination. I got to be honest. It includes, in my opinion, I think the entire spectrum of LGBTQIA, 2A, PP+. There's some other ones. IA. I'm not trying to be silly. I'm trying to literally show like it's not LGBT. It's well beyond this. Let's read. The Supreme Court ruled Monday that a landmark civil rights law protects LGBT people from discrimination in employment, a resounding victory for LGBT rights from a conservative court. The court decided by a 6-3 vote that a key provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, known as the Title VII, that bars job discrimination because of sex, among other reasons, encompasses bias against LGBT workers. Quote, an employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote for the court, sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids. A well-articulated argument that for the most part I agree with. It's a very good point. Think about it this way. If there is somebody who is male, let's remove gender or sex or whatever from the equation. If there is somebody who is in love with a male. If this person is female, you probably wouldn't question it. If this person is male and you do question it, you are specifically targeting them on the basis of their sex. It's actually a really good point. And I agree with it. Now, the issue with transgender is different because these are cultural issues for the most part. Unless they issue in their ruling or in legislation, which does not exist, that trans specifically refers to people who are undergoing some kind of medical treatment or in some way you can delineate what is or isn't trans, this one actually is broken and is wrong. Now, keeping in mind, I do not believe companies should be able to discriminate on the basis of gender identity. That's just my personal opinion. However, I do have questions about how you define gender identity, and this is the real challenge. Let me try and simplify this for you. If there is someone who is transgender in that they were born male and they now identify as female and they, have gender dysphoria, and we are absolutely trying to protect their rights and everything, I think we shouldn't discriminate based on these characteristics that ultimately have nothing to do with whether or not they can perform the job, unless, of course, they affect how you can perform the job, which is where things start to get more complicated, I suppose. In a lot of the laws we've seen in state jurisdictions, like New York, for instance, they talk about your self-image, your personal view. They talk about the fact that gender doesn't actually mean male or female. It could mean both or neither or anything else. In which case, I would say on the basis of their argument, they fundamentally misunderstand what transgender is. Or I could actually put it a different way. I think they're taking a good faith, standard, colloquial understanding of the word transgender to apply it to this, in which case I believe it does sort of make sense. But here are the questions I have. The homosexual issue, or the bisexual issue, I totally get. But trans, so if there is a male who begins wearing female clothing and you can't fire them for this, what if you have a dress code? Okay, there's a lot of questions pertaining to what qualifies someone to be transgender and what qualifies being fired for being transgender. If your company says it's standard to wear pants and someone comes in and says pants don't conform to my identity because I'm trans and they want to wear a skirt or something, would that be considered firing them because of a violation of dress code? Or would it be considered firing them because of their choice to identify in a certain gender? Yes, I know there's obvious answers to this particular analogy. Are females allowed to wear these things? Are males not? But it starts to get murky when you talk about what qualifies as someone identifying as another gender. Because there's quite literally a man, I believe in Seattle, who is literally just a presenting male. Okay, this is a person with a beard who wears normal male clothing, very, very well known in the trans rights community. And this individual identifies as female with a beard and everything, saying that they're trying to break down what it means to truly be female because gender identity is a social construct. In which case, how do you actually define whether or not someone is or isn't discriminating? I think for the most part, there's a good faith attempt at understanding what transgender is, but they don't understand. I believe these justices don't really understand the current arguments for and what trans it really is. Let's read more, and then I'll show you some better examples to try and break this down. Justice Alito, Kavanaugh, and Thomas dissented. Quote, "The court tries to convince readers that it is merely enforcing the terms of the statute, but that is preposterous," Alito wrote in the dissent. "Even as understood today, the concept of discrimination because of sex is different from discrimination because of orientation or identity." They say the outcome is expected to have a big impact for the estimated 8.1 million LGBT workers across the country because most states don't protect them from workplace discrimination. An estimated 11.3 million LGBT people visit the U.S., according to the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School. But Monday's decision is not likely to be the court's last word on a host of issues revolving around LGBT rights, Gorsuch noted. Lawsuits are pending over transgender athletes' participation in school sporting events, and courts are also dealing with cases about sex-segregated bathrooms and locker rooms, a subject that justices seemed concerned about during arguments in October. Employers of religious objections to employing LGBT people also might be able to raise those claims in a different case, Gorsuch said. But none of these other laws are before us. We have not had the benefit of adversarial testing about the meaning of the terms. And we do not prejudge any such question today, he wrote. The cases were the court's first on LGBT rights since Justice Anthony Kennedy's retirement and replacement by Kavanaugh. So this is a 6-3 ruling. I mean, this is it's fairly strong. It's not 5-4. It's not, 9-0 or 8-1 or whatever. No, you've got 6-3. Decently strong, not the strongest, kind of in the middle. But there are a lot of issues that I have to bring up. Again, for the millionth time, I know that the left is already trying to straw man me by asking the simple question. But I'm going to show you this from, this is New York City's example of how they define gender, expression, and identity, and nonconforming. And then I want to present you some questions I have for how the Supreme Court has ruled and present some potential problems. First, before I read anything, based on their interpretation of what sex means in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, they have stated, for the purpose of the law, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which specifically includes several categories, which I find very, very interesting, mind you. It includes race, gender, national origin, not gender, I'm sorry, sex. Here's what they're arguing. Transgender, in order to discriminate based on being trans, you are incorporating sex into this. And the same thing with homosexuality. Therefore, these two issues are derivative of sex. I then have a question. To what else would be protected under the exact same argument? And would we need to go to court for any future cases involving anything derivative of sex? Here's a question I posed on Twitter. Not as a literal argument, as a literal question. And maybe you guys can comment below. There have been people who identify as transgender and trans species. They say that part of their gender identity is tiger. I am not exaggerating or making this up, and I am not trying to discredit or strawman. I'm asking a literal question, so please, for the sake of this, let's just have an intelligent conversation. If someone says that their gender identity is female tiger because gender is a social construct, would they have or not have these protections? One could argue that a person altering their body or face in a certain way and growling and walking on all fours might not be protected because it has nothing to do with sex. But what if they incorporate that into their identity? You could argue that they gain the protections to be the other sex, but what if their expression of this involves being a tiger? I mean, I'm asking a serious question because it does come up in New York City. Take a look at their definitions here. This is from their human rights law. Their gender definition says, gender includes actual or perceived sex, identity, and expression, including a person's actual or perceived gender-related self-image. Now, first, I must present the issue of how do you define gender by using gender over and over again? You're operating under the assumption we know what you mean by gender, but gender is supposed to define what gender is, and you're not doing that. They say, gender includes, so perceived gender-related self-image, appearance, behavior, expression, or other gender-related characteristics, regardless of the sex assigned to that person at birth. Now, I understand. This is what courts are for. I actually talked to a lawyer a few years ago, asking them how would this be interpreted if someone said they were otherkin. And they said a judge would laugh them out of the room. Because we understand what the goal of this is. People born one of the biological sexes. However, they go on to say that gender identity could be the same as or different from one. So here we go. Gender nonconforming is a term used to describe a person whose gender expression differs from gender stereotypes, norms, and expectations in a given culture or historical period. Terms associated with gender nonconformity include, but are not limited to, gender expansive, gender variant, or gender diverse. They say gender identity is the internal, deeply held sense of one's gender, which may be the same as or different from one's sex assigned at birth. A person's identity may be male, female, neither or both. Neither or both. That's the question I had. Now, if someone says their identity is neither, and what would that mean? Well, it has to be something, right? Would they make up their own cultural norms for what is gender? In which case, how do you define this? I am not saying that anybody, look, I believe that all peoples are deserving of respect. I just want to make sure we know the rules so we don't step on anybody's toes. That's fair, right? If you want to make sure that I, in the course of my doing business, am respectful of your identity, I need to know what that means. And right now, they quite literally say identity could be neither male nor female or both. If a non-binary or genderqueer, what does non-binary mean? When you look at the internet list of genders for non-binary genders, there are thousands. There was one, I'm not making this up, it's literally called hydrogender. And they say a gender that is much like water. I don't know what that means. So if you're now saying that gender is literally a social construct and can be whatever you want it to be, you can't define what transgender is. And so this is just New York City, not the federal level. The federal level, I think, is taking a very narrow view of what transgender really means. But when you, so this is actually interesting because this has come up with, I believe, and I could be getting some of this wrong, so forgive me, I'm not intending to. ContraPoints, you may be familiar with, a very popular transgender YouTuber who has actually, and again, I could be getting this wrong, I'm trying not to has posted about the previous generation's understanding of what trans means, meaning there's male and there's female, it's binary trans, versus the new age Gen Z version of trans, which is literally whatever you want it to be. Okay, let's take a look at gender expression. They say, gender expression is the representation of gender as expressed through one's name, pronouns, clothing, hairstyle, behavior, voice, or similar characteristics. Gender expression may or may not conform to gender stereotypes, norms, and expectations in a given culture or historical period. Gender expression is not the same as orientation or identity. Terms associated with gender expression include, but are not limited to, androgynous, butch, male, female, woman, feminine, femme, gender nonconforming, male, man, masculine, or non-binary. Okay, pronouns. Has this been confusing enough for you? I'm sorry. We know now that there are pronouns that are made up. Z, zer, things like that. They have literally said that it may be male, female, or neither. Male and female, as we know, are she, her, he, him, and the neutral is they, them. It could be both. What would both be? She, him, his, her? I don't know. But neither could also be these made up pronouns, right? Here's the question I had to a lawyer. If someone goes in and says that their gender includes their gender-related self-image, which is female tiger, would a court rule that is protected? I was told by this lawyer that in all likelihood, the judge it wouldn't pass the laugh test. A judge would laugh it out of the courtroom. Basically, courts are designed to interpret the law to what they really should mean, and we're supposed to have a general understanding of what these things are. However, the problem I proposed is, if someone comes in and says, under this law, I'm protected, and a judge determines that your perception of your identity is incorrect, then why wouldn't they be able to do that to literally any other interpretation of gender identity? In which case, we would set precedent for a very, very rigid view of what gender identity is. Thus, gender is not a social construct because the judge would literally have to argue it specifically refers to this, that, and these things. Okay, the point I'm trying to make here with the Supreme Court's ruling, and again, I'm sorry if this is confusing because I think it's confusing myself, is that my best understanding of this, and with the modern culture, is that there are many people who have a unique, made-up view of gender. They say that your clothing doesn't define gender. You have people, a very prominent, high-profile transgender person who is not on hormones or any therapy, but is literally just a biological male saying they are trans and trying to break down gender stereotypes. Does that qualify or not? I honestly don't know. So look, maybe I've made my point, and in that it's very difficult to make the point at all because this is all very ill-defined. They're trying to define it, but unfortunately, there is no easy way to define what this is. Let me just make a few quick points. First of all, some people have said that this ruling from the Supreme Court will result in transgender athletes competing against females like biological males. That's not true. This is about gender employment only. So the lawsuits pertaining to trans athletes, we'll still see what happens. And I think that's, for the most part, one thing I definitely wanted to break down. That you need to understand, this is specifically about jobs. So how this plays out, I don't know. I also point out, some people have said, does this mean that someone who's about to get fired could simply say they're trans and thus they can't be fired? No, that's not how it works. The benefit, the privilege, dare I say, is still in the hands of the employers because the employers are the ones who define why you were fired. Now, as the employee who gets fired, you still have to argue why You believe they fired you on the basis of sex, gender identity, or whatever. The issue is, if your boss comes to you and says, you spilled milk on the carpet, you're fired, you'll have to argue why it was really about your gender identity or your orientation. For the most part, this is always very difficult to prove, okay? Even though we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, someone could fire you because they don't like you on the basis of your national origin, race, religion, and they'll just lie. And they'll say, this person was rather disruptive. People didn't like them. They didn't get along with them. It has nothing to do with these characteristics. And how do you prove it? Some people will keep a log of the times things have happened, but even that isn't necessarily enough. Typically, employers may just settle with you. But in the end, it's still not a guarantee that you won't be discriminated against. And in fact, they're adding this, I don't think will change a whole lot. So look, I guess we'll leave it there. What this will lead to, I believe it will lead to some dramatic changes moving forward. This may actually reduce what gender identity is perceived as. So all the gender nonconforming stuff might actually get erased by this, because I believe you will end up seeing more lawsuits now, which will have to find their way to the Supreme Court. Notably, if someone says they're transgender, and that means that part of their gender being a social construct is to wear a giant clown costume. I'm being absurd on purpose. The point I'm trying to make is that if gender is a social construct, and that wearing pants or a skirt does not define gender, and you can wear whatever you want, what's to stop someone from wearing something absurd and saying, you can't make me conform to your gender standards? Someone could end up wearing something absurd, and then a job may say, you're not allowed to wear that. Unfortunately, they are allowed to wear that under the immediate interpretation of the law. If a judge throws the case out saying it's too absurd and he laughs at it, then what's to stop another judge from saying, I too can throw out whatever I want? Look, these kinds of rulings have happened in the past. We've eventually braided the random twines together to find the cohesive path forward. Ultimately, I think this will make some chaos in the immediate. It will result in kind of like fairly chaotic and difficult to understand moments. But ultimately, in the long run, we will figure out what it means. We will start to agree on certain terms. And this actually could curtail a lot of the Gen Z non-binary trans stuff, because if the Supreme Court is ruling that it is derivative of sex, then the non-binary argument actually gets pushed aside. So this precedent may actually be damaging in the long run. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully YouTube doesn't ban me for trying to have the conversation, but hey, you know how things go. So anyway, stick around. The next segment will be coming up at 4 p.m. over at timcast.net. Check it out, and I will see you all then.